to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by
Jim Tankersley, Economic Policy Correspondent at the Washington Post.
Thanks for coming on with me, Jim. I wanted to have you on because you wrote a piece that I found really interesting recently on Charles Koch's charitable giving to colleges and universities around the country. And before we get into the policy implications and a lot of the perception around academia in general, I wanted you to tell me a little bit about kind of how you formulated this piece, how it came to be, and how you actually got into some of these really interesting discussions that you guys have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the more interesting sort of backstories of a story that I've done, certainly while I've been at the Post, maybe in my whole career, because it took a really long time. It started off years ago. Before I came to the Post, I worked for a magazine called National Journal, and I wrote a lot of long, wonky pieces about the economy, and I was always on the lookout for interesting stories about things happening around the country and the economy that might turn into broader, intellectual discussions for a magazine piece. And one of the pieces that I ran across was from down in Florida, where there was all of this furor at Florida State University over the question of whether the university should accept money from the Charles Koch Foundation for economics professors there. He wanted the foundation was going to fund some professorships, and there was a big outcry on campus, and I wanted to know what it was all about. But I also wanted to know why Charles Koch was interested in funding economics professors, which, for people not like you and me, can seem like a fairly unsexy investment compared to, spending big on political campaigns. So I started asking the Koch folks right away if they would, make him available for an interview, and it took a long time. So several years later, they after me sort of following up maybe once out of every 6 months for the last few years, they finally said yes. So I flew to Wichita, Kansas, and went to the Koch Industries headquarters and into Charles's personal office, and we had this fascinating intellectual discussion that was supposed to last an hour and ended up going 100 minutes. And I think both he and I would have had things to talk about still for on at least another 100. So it was really fun. Before I went out, he gave me a reading list, which was kind of hilarious, a bunch of philosophy books and economics books that he really was into. And the point of it was, and the point that came across in the interview was, Charles Koch has a deep sort of philosophical goal in funding academic research. It's not necessarily what you'd expect. His critics say it's not. He's either not pursuing it or he's not being truthful in what he claims his goals are. But the roots of it are fascinatingly enough in kind of an obscure 10-page paper from a British scientist in the 60s that has kind of come to define how Charles Koch thinks about the pursuit of knowledge and the dispensing of his money.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that obscure British paper. It's Michael Polanyi, am I pronouncing that correct? It's called The Republic of Science, and you said in your piece for the Washington Post that it's kind of a guiding principle for how Charles Koch views academia in general and how he steers some of his funding. So I wanted to ask you, what are the ideas behind that paper, and how would, a billionaire philanthropist put them into action?
Right. It's interesting. He can't remember exactly when or how he was introduced to it. It was probably in the 60s. He went through this fascinating period of his life. He had Charles Koch is a very smart man who had graduated from MIT and sort of thought in math in a lot of ways, as to put it, like a very numeric thinker. But he was working as a management consultant, and in sort of his spare time was reading all this philosophy. And my favorite detail, which I led the piece with, was he read a lot of Karl Marx and Mao and Lenin, and then also like Aristotle and Descartes and then Hayek and all of these, classical Austrian economists. And in this sort of pursuit of knowledge, Charles Koch ran across this tract, Republic of Science, And it fit. I think it just sort of brought together a lot of the ways Charles Koch thinks about the world and the economy. He very much believes in personal liberty and freedom as the great catalysts of the advancement of humanity, is, I think, the really broad way to put it. But the Republic of Science takes the idea of a free market in economics and applies it to science, and basically says that the advancement of scientific knowledge is best pursued not by some governing body saying we should spend all of our research money on cancer, or we should spend all of our research money on curing polio or whatever, but by allowing individual scientists to compete for research dollars with their own best ideas, and letting what he sort of defines as scientific consensus, which is basically just a free market of allocation of resources, decide who gets funded and who doesn't. It sounds very simple, but it's actually Polanyi was really reacting to some movements that had happened in Britain in the mid-century toward trying to get more of a public interest steering the idea of scientific research. We should do things that we believe are in the best interest of the public, will advance human society most. And Polanyi was arguing that, no, we shouldn't do that. We should let scientific consensus determine what gets funded, because we can't possibly know what's going to advance knowledge the most. So this very much influences Charles Koch. In our interview, he used the words Republic of Science 23 times, by my count, and referred to it a bunch of other times without saying it. But what he sees himself doing now, he spent more than $200 million, probably a lot more than that, since 1980, setting up research centers, funding graduate students, funding professorships at colleges and universities. And what he sees himself as doing is he is trying to create this Republic of Science. He is trying to fund research where the money goes to the very best people in the field, and his goal, he says, is to advance human knowledge, to improve life, to improve our world by advancing science as best as possible.
So I wanted to ask kind of how the economic consensus part of this plays in, because it seems like all of the descriptions kind of that he's pulling from, or at least that you describe in the article, are kind of contrary to whatever an economic consensus might be. I mean, if there exists a consensus, it doesn't seem to me all that self-evident that, groups of private individuals would be better at ascertaining what that is than, say, a centrally planned and directed government body. And that, if you're actually having people, compete on the basis of ideas, the whole point of that seems to be more innovative, more undermining of whatever a consensus might be. And I'm just not sure how that plays in here.
I think the idea, if you think about it like as an invisible hand as opposed to a scientific consensus, the idea is that the market is just going to figure out what the best research is and fund it. And if it's not the best research, it's not going to get money anymore. So in the same way that in a perfectly modeled economy, businesses rise up, are created and grow and die based on how well they deliver products that people want. The same thing is true of a model of scientific research in this sort of Republic of Science model, which is ideas grow and either continue to grow and receive funding or die, be based on sort of their merit as determined by the marketplace. Now, that's really tricky to conceptualize what that would actually look like in a university setting, because funding just doesn't come from the air and go to who's best, and it's hard to determine. I mean, in a true marketplace, somebody buys and somebody sells. With university research, it's somebody writes a grant proposal and somebody else funds it. But there aren't always great links between what the outcome is of the research and whether it keeps getting funded. So Koch, I think, sees himself as trying to do that. He has particular sets of criteria that people have to follow if they're trying to get money from his foundation. Koch himself doesn't actually dispense the money, but he's hired a team, and they know what sort of things he values. The interesting thing, though, is that, I mean, what we're really talking about is what questions get researched. You know, what in economics or in social science or whatever, the power of money is to decide what sort of thing gets discussed, what sort of question is researched. And on that front, Charles Koch has preferences. He is more interested in questions about the interaction of personal liberty and restrictions on personal liberty and then overall performances of the economy than he is about questions about, for example, is income inequality skewing the performance of the economy? Now, he's open to those questions, he says, and he even said he'd be happy to fund a smart Marxist project if one was presented to him. But he tends to fund a similar type of research effort, and whether that's because the people who seek his money believe that that's all he wants to fund, or whether it's because the ways in which he's dispensed his money have incentivized more of that type of research, in either way, the overall output from the folks he funds tends to be research that looks at these questions that match up with kind of the Charles Koch worldview of how society and economies best function.
Right, and what you just said seems to be far more of a values question than an empirics question, right? So if you're funding a chair in economics, the question of whether researching income inequality is more important than researching the effects of a minimum wage is more of a values question than we can exactly pinpoint, how important subject X research is and subject Y research is. And so even if let's say that Charles Koch is funding a Marxist economics professor in theory, whether the Marxist economics professor studies income inequality or the effects of a minimum wage are very different from, just a question of economics. It seems to me to be more of a values thing. And I think you're right there in that, what to study is just as important as the kind of person who is doing the studying.
Yeah, and, Charles Koch, I mean, he cares about the type of person who's doing it too. He wants intellectually curious people. He wants really big thinkers. Part of, I think, what he's trying to do here is find, invest in particularly young people, graduate students, young professors who grow up to become really important researchers. He's very proud, for example, of how early on he began giving some grant assistance to Tyler Cowen at George Mason University, who is one of our most interesting public intellectuals, frankly, in America right now. And Koch feels like he partially discovered him. His support of him goes back to when Cowen was still a student, and so. In that way, picking interesting people, and he's funded Tyler on a bunch of different research endeavors, basically. In that way, you can see a difference from saying, oh, I'm only going to fund Tyler if he's interested in looking at the effects of regulations on the economy, which doesn't appear to be what Koch does. But he ends up funding a lot of people who are interested in the effects of regulations on the economy. And that's a really, I say in the piece, that's a really important question in economics right now. But there are other important questions in economics that don't get funded by Koch money. Maybe they don't need Koch money. Maybe he's counterbalancing other biases in economics. But this is one of the, I think, really fascinating philosophical questions about what's happening with his money, which is he's a big force. He has created a lot of positions, a lot of professorships, a lot of graduate fellowships. And so the question of whether he is supplementing and rounding out a true market of ideas, or whether he's distorting a market of ideas, is what I try to wrestle with in the piece.
Yeah, and I think you do a pretty good job. This is probably a good point as any to, I guess, disclose, now that I'm thinking of it, that the Franklin Center has done work with lots of different arms of the Koch network in general. We have had Koch Associate Program interns work with us in the past, so in case that colors anyone's perception of what I'm talking about, I suspect this is a good time because I wanted to ask you next, how about the critics of what Charles Koch is doing in academia are coming across as. And I found, I guess, two related but distinct lines of criticism in your piece. One, that, he's trying to incubate his libertarian ideas in academia, where if we had a, pure market in academia, maybe libertarian ideas would not have as large of an audience or a following. So he's kind of tipping the scales in that way. And the other criticism that it looked like was people saying it's purely a business motive, and that he's getting, economics researchers basically justifying low regulatory environments because that helps the business side of his interests to grow. So I wanted to kind of ask how both, I guess, you found Charles Koch to be receptive to those kinds of criticisms, and how much merit you find in them.
Well, I would break it down as follows. There are a group of academics who in particular feel like the way in which Koch dispenses his money and the sort of the types of things that get funded stand in tension with what they believe are traditional academic freedom. They think there are too many strings attached to the money, or that by only funding certain types of research and not others, Koch is behaving in a way that kind of sells out. When universities take his money, they're kind of selling out and giving him power and his foundation power that they wouldn't give to other donors. That's sort of like the purest academic argument. Although, and I would really point out, and I think this is, I did not find a person who disputed this in the piece. Every researcher I talked to who took Koch Foundation money said that they had never once heard from the foundation any sort of pressure to change a research finding or rescind one. And I think that's an important caveat to that first critique, that there are important process questions in academia, and I think they are valid and need to be aired. But in terms of the results, the bigger problem that most people have with the results is they think that the questions are too narrowly defined, and that if you look long enough in these certain fields, you're going to find answers that Koch likes, as opposed to, they feel like that the foundation's got its thumb on the scale of the answers. So that's one bucket of critics. The other bucket of critics, with the folks like the Uncoke My Campus movement, really believes that all this money is just a part of Koch's political strategy. That either he's trying to train more students to think in libertarian ways and create more conservative voters, or by the bigger extension, he is underwriting research which gives credence to legislative pushes, to roll back regulations, to sort of implement a libertarian philosophy in state, in particular, legislatures all over the world, but also, or all over the country, but also in Congress and in the judiciary, and that in so doing, he's protecting his profits. That low regulations help Koch industries, and so therefore, that's why all of this is a really long game in which Koch is trying to protect his profits or boost his profits, and this is just sort of an arm of his political operation. Those are the two big veins of critique.
Yeah, so you mentioned strings coming attached with this money, and I wanted to ask you, I guess, how some of these grants or endowments work, and how they might be different than any other grant or endowment. So if you have, the Charles Koch Chair of Economics at Florida State or what have you, how is that different than, a lot of other foundations that might fund chairs? Are the strings attached different in any way, or are people just worried about the name itself?
Well, some of it's different and some of it's not. The things that are one big thing, a difference between an endowed chair and what Koch is doing is that an endowed chair, if we want to create the Kevin Glass Chair in Houston Rockets research at Harvard University, then you would give them a ton of money, and that would go into a place that funds a professorship over time, and theoretically you can't take that money back. There may be, you set up all sorts of conditions, I guess, when you give it to him, that the building's going to be named after you, or that the chair is going to be named after you, or whatever. But that money is there. Koch grants tend to be annual, and or they're for a set amount of years, and if they're for a set amount of years, they can be canceled by the foundation. And they often stipulate in the contract that they're like, if you give the money to the business school at Harvard, for example, the foundation will often stipulate that this money will stay there so long as the current dean of the business school is the dean. And then if that dean leaves, then the money can be rescinded. And what the Koch folks say that does is protect against universities basically doing a bunch of shell games with the money, where they close down a center, but they keep this money, and so then it ends up funding something that the foundation didn't want it to fund. What the critics see is the Kochs trying to influence, say, hey, you need to keep our people in charge. That's not, that's too much influence. If the university wants to fire the head of the business school, it should be able to do that. Particularly with public universities, the big concern I heard from folks at Florida State and other places was if they pull their money out midway through because they don't like the results, they're leaving taxpayers holding the bag, and that's bad.
So what's your view of the strings? I mean, do you think that they're onerous? And I guess secondarily, has money that's been promised to be granted on a yearly basis ever been rescinded for any reason under, I guess, let's say both Koch money or under any other circumstance that any other foundation or company might give?
I mean, there have certainly been instances in academia where people have tried to take their money back. The Florida State's really interesting because I think it was a place where definitely the foundation, they had an initial way of going about it that was not the best. They had set up they had a contract that allowed them to set up a committee basically in which Koch would have direct influence over hiring. People went nuts, and they never constituted the committee, and that's not included in the contracts they have now. But it raised a lot of suspicions, and I think for right or for wrong, the onus is on the foundation, like it would be with any foundation, to show that there is academic integrity in the things they fund. So on that question, again, like I was in San Francisco this year at the big economics conference, once a year big economics conference where all the big papers are presented. And I saw Alex Tabarrok, who's a very smart professor from Mercatus, stand up and say, this is my paper that I did about regulations in entrepreneurship. And I built a data set of how much regulation has grown over time in various industries. And I set out absolutely believing that I was going to show that the more that an industry has been regulated over the last 30 years, the worse its entrepreneurship rates were. And I didn't find that at all. I found no relationship. And it surprised me, but it's important and I'm reporting it. And he told me he has never heard a word from them. And when I asked Charles Koch about that, he said, great, I'm glad he found it and reported it. We're trying to find out what the truth is. That's not the only example of something. And there is, as I noted in the piece, just a few months later, different researchers at Mercatus took the same regulation data set, paired it with a different question, this one about growth, and did find a very bad effect of regulations. Regulations have chilled economic growth. So it's a hedgy answer, but I think, and I try to sort of make it come across in the piece, that the concern that resonates a lot with me is this question of, if you are defining the questions, is there a risk that you are eventually only going to get answers? People are only going to bring projects to you that they think are going to find answers that you want to hear, that you don't even have to tell them. We want to know. We want research to show that carbon regulation kills the economy. People just assume that's what you want, and so that's what they look for. And so I think that's the sort of thing that would worry me if I ran a university. No matter who was funding stuff, I would constantly be asking: are we asking? And this is a problem that we journalists have too. Are we asking questions that conflict with our own prior beliefs? Are we looking for evidence for things that make ourselves wrong or that disprove our own premises? And I think a true Republic of Science does that. A true competition of ideas is always open to the fact that we were completely wrong on something, or that our assumptions about something are wrong. And And so that's, I think, that and this is a much bigger point than Koch, but I think that's the big challenge for academics across the board right now, is how do we ask those questions that challenge everyone's preconceptions?
Sure, and I wanted to ask you about, I guess, because when I started looking into this, because I remember going to college, I remember certain professors having endowed chairs with names on them or companies on them, and I didn't really understand or question that as an undergraduate student. But I saw a couple different places where it wasn't just you could get an endowed chair for a one-time gift, but you could give, $200,000 over the course of 15 years as a yearly grant to get, a chair named after you or your company. And, there are a ton of different foundations, obviously, that funds these sorts of things. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funds research and chairs at certain universities, the Annenberg Foundation. But even, giant corporations are doing this too. So I found, and you probably saw this, I tweeted, I found, Pfizer endows a chair in pharmaceutical research. I don't remember at what school that is. At UCLA, they have like a Northrop Grumman chair of engineering, and I think a Lockheed Martin chair too. So it looks, the Koch aspect of it aside, it certainly looks, when you're starting to research some of these things, like all of this academic research already is funded by corporations or foundations that aren't exactly, completely disinterested parties or completely, neutral charities here. So how, I guess, is the Koch finger on the scales any different from, let's say we're in a republic of science, and let's say all of these foundations and corporations are funding all of this academic research. How does the entry of the Charles Koch Foundation into the equation, does that really change everything all that much?
Yeah. I just looked this up to triple check it, but there's a really great example. I'm going to pick on my own alma mater here. So Stanford University's Graduate School of Business got an enormous donation from Phil Knight, the one of the founders of Nike, and they built a beautiful new business school. It is a gorgeous place to go. They do all sorts of interesting work. They have high integrity academics up and down the organization, and if they were, for some reason, if the Justice Department were to be looking at, let's say Nike and Under Armour decided they wanted to merge, and the Justice Department suddenly started looking into this as anti-competitive, and the Stanford Business School produced a piece of research about it, no matter what that piece of research said, you'd ask extra questions about it. If they said that the Justice Department is wrong, you would wonder if the Knight money had anything to do with that. And if it said, no, this is a bad merger, you'd wonder if that was going to get recriminations from Phil Knight. Now, there are ways, universities have been dealing with these problems for a really long time. They've had big money donors for a really long time. So they have institutional ways around it. I think and institutional ways of dealing with these problems and reassuring people that the research is in fact of high integrity. With the Kochs, I think the reason that it's so particularly controversial are, one, that they do some things a little bit different from their private foundations. Two, that they are funding a branch of economics that has real political implications, is the way I would put it. And I mean, you can disagree. Reasonable people disagree about where the interesting questions are in economics. I don't know any reasonable economists who say we shouldn't teach Hayek ever. We shouldn't teach the Austrians ever, and libertarianism is a completely invalid course of study. Even if I disagree entirely with it, that's something that I think some critics of Koch have kind of missed. They cast it as this tossed out thing in economics, and it's not a live portion of what most economists study, but neither is Marxism. Most economists aren't reading the classic philosophers of the profession. They're looking at empirical mathematical equations to help us to understand big things in theory and practice now. So I think the third reason, the really big reason, is that this probably wouldn't wouldn't have raised so many questions if not for how active the Koch brothers have been politically, and the suspicions, again, by folks like the Uncooked My Campus, that this is part of the machine. This is part of a grand strategy to influence politics. And when you have actors who have demonstrably influenced politics, I think that's in large part what is making the question so much more live with them than with other donors.
Right. And I would probably say there are conservatives who would defend this kind of, well, let's say that the critics are right, just grant them that, the only thing the Kochs are interested in is a politically motivated agenda, which I don't think is true, but I think there are conservatives who would defend it on practical grounds, just to say that, academia, whatever its merits or demerits, is overwhelmingly helmed by liberals and progressives and people who are left of center on the American ideological spectrum, and that, that just because a lot of academia is staffed by liberals and progressives doesn't mean that there's no merit in ideas on the other side of the partisan spectrum, and that, artificially injecting some ideological diversity isn't always a bad thing. And I remember when I was a student, a big thing that conservatives and libertarian-ish students were concerned about, and kind of in a, I think, really dumb and false way, we're all dumb when we're 18 and 19 years old, that, universities are so invested in what they call diversity, and conservatives obviously say, well, you're interested in diversity of background and identity and skin color, but you're not interested in ideological diversity. And you look at, I think in the social sciences, it's like 5-to-1, 6-to-1 people who identify as liberal versus conservative. And in the humanities, it's even higher. It's like 10 or 20-to-1. And the hard sciences, it's a little bit lower, but it's still pretty overwhelmingly ideologically liberal. And that, getting people who are interested in funding some people who are researching the questions that American conservatives think are more important might not be a bad thing on the whole.
So I think the really interesting question there is, and there's one exception, but we'll come back to it. And the really interesting question is, has the money Koch has spent on, seeding this sort of research crowded out, if you will, research into other things? And I just don't think there's any evidence of it. We have at this meeting in San Francisco from the American Economic Association, there was more inequality research than any other topic. There is a lot of interest and live debate right now over the role of the size of government and the performance of the economy. There's a lot of interest in questions of entrepreneurship. There's a lot of interest in questions of things like criminal justice reform, which is another thing that Koch has funded. And I don't see a trade-off between, if there's 10 more people studying the regulations questions today than there were yesterday, it doesn't appear to me that there are, not enough people studying inequality. I would say that the worry might be, well, that you keep studying topics after they are done being live, and you are unable to pivot and transition and follow what that sort of republic of science, where the marketplace of ideas would take you to the next frontiers of research. But I don't see evidence that we've necessarily hit that yet, and certainly not there's no evidence that the economics profession lacks for new ideas or new and interesting things to study. In fact, the financial crisis appears to have reinvigorated that. Lots of new ways of trying to think about how the world and the economy work. I would say there's one place, though, where people make the really fair critique that Koch-funded research may be in tension with kind of the evolving scientific consensus, and that's in climate science. That's not as much money that as he spent, and frankly, most of the stuff that is Koch-funded on climate comes not from universities, but from think tanks and even political advocacy groups. But climate scientists were the ones who were most, and climate activists were the ones who were most upset about the story, because they felt like it did not dive deeply enough into the question of has Koch funded efforts to undermine scientific consensus on climate. But I think in general, on the overall big economics questions in particular, the vast majority of his spending, I didn't hear anybody make the argument that because Charles is spending all this money, we don't have enough research into X, Y, or Z interesting topic.
Also, probably, the conservative critique is that it's not like, academia has a paucity of Marxists compared with the general population in America.
Right, exactly.
But I think that's a good place to leave it right now. But I will say that you had a follow-up piece where you kind of posted your discussion of climate science with Charles Koch on the Washington Post, and hopefully we can get that link on the Blogging Heads page as well. But I think that's a pretty good place to leave it, unless you have anything further on that.
Well, the last thing I wanted to say for the audience, and I'm not exactly sure when we're going to do this, but we are going to publish either it's a long interview. I think the final transcript is close to 12,000 words, but we're going to publish either most of it or all of it soon, because I want people to see it's a really wonky philosophical discussion, and it's a really interesting side of Charles Koch that I don't think people see very often. So stay tuned for that, because I think that's going to be fun once we've posted it.
Sure thing, and thanks again for joining me, Jim, and I will see everyone next time on Blogging Heads.